Welcome to Boomhauer69's channel, and today I'm gonna do a video here of an article I found on Popular Science about an electric car from the 1900s. When I saw this article, I thought, oh wow, article about a vintage car from the 1900s, because I'm fascinated with cars from the 1900s and in the early days of automobiles. I'm fascinated with the old cars that were going when we was going from horseless buggies to horseless carriages and so on. Some people like the cars from the 60s and 70s and the muscle car era, but me, I've always been more into the cars from the 1900s and the early days of automobiling, So yeah, let's get to it. I'll read this article here about this car from the 1900s, and I've always also been fascinated with other vintage technology as well, like old vintage farm equipment and different things as well, and maybe I'll do some articles on that. It says, this electric car was cutting edge in 1908. What's it like to drive it? ? This story is an expedited, I think I pronounced that right, EXCERPTED, expedited from The Drive. So they must have kind of copied it from some other website Popular Science did. It says, electric vehicles are much more long-standing tradition of car culture than we often give them credit for. Ask someone of the first electric vehicles, EV, that pops to mind. And they got abbreviated here, EV, which stands for electric vehicle, that pops to mind. And the unusual responses will be from the past couple of decades. The original Tesla Roadster, perhaps the late 1990s GM EV1 may be in a rare case awkward 70s wedge-shaped commuter car, but well before any of these modern electric cars were dreamt up, there was a battle between electric vehicles and ICE cars that was fierce. It made today's market look like a church bake sale. We know how it turned out. The gas station situated on every highway and thoroughfare throughout the countries, compared with often pitiful and scant electric charging infrastructures, is proof that gasoline won the first battle, but it wasn't for the lack of effort or well-built cars. And I'll show you here the picture here with my tablet. Well, there's the vintage car they're talking about. I don't know if you can see that very well. It's kind of grainy, but it says, and this is called the Columbia Automobile Company went bankrupt 4 years after it released the Victoria Phantom and photo of the Victoria Scott and Drive. So it must be there was a company called Columbia Automotive Company that made that car. And this is a 1908 Columbia Electric Victorian Phantom built by the Columbia Automotive Company. It represents the final glory days for a Marquis, MARQUE, Marquis, that once was posed to become an automotive Gothlin on par with General Motors, and instead ended its history as a bankrupt footnote just 4 years after this carriage rode off the assembly line. In rolling driving proof that there was vibrant electric vehicle market over a century ago, all thought it's more appropriate to call it an electric horseless carriage than a car. 1908 Colombian Electric Victoria Phantom by the numbers. Powertrain, single electric motor, 48 volts. Volt array of lead acid batteries, rear wheel drive. Price when new was $1,600, which is around $44,000 in 2021 dollars. Because you gotta remember, back then, if you had $1,600, you was a pretty well-to-do person. Top speed of 15 miles per hour. You could probably pedal faster than this thing could go, but nowadays we have electric handicap mobility scooters that could go faster than that. Seating capacity too. But this back then was like basically like the hoverboards and little electric scooters of its day. The Colombian thoughts forgotten teaches an interesting lesson for the future Berlusian battles. Penthouse to the payment. To fully appreciate this car and understand how a company that was first to ever sell 1,000 cars in a year ever became little more than a niche curiosity, some background is necessary. At the dawn of the 20th century, there's existed three options to propel a carriage that wasn't a horse: steam, gasoline, and electric. Steam was popular for its familiarity. Steam for power generation had been in use for decades at this point. Because back then there was a lot of ships that used steam, and you had the locomotive trains that were a main popular transportation. Because back then they didn't have no airplanes. Airplanes were still being developed by the Wright brothers, and so therefore, probably obviously the Wright brothers, I think, was a little bit later on in the 1900s that invented airplanes. But airplanes really haven't been invented yet. Nobody really thought about flying, so steam locomotives were the main source of getting around this country. Instead of bus, you would take a train. Been in use for decades at this point, but steam power requires a massive high-pressure boil, known for its propensity to explode, onboard water storage, or an expensive, high-maintenance condenser, and immense amount of time to get a motor actually running, starting, steaming, cold, or water minutes on cold. Now, what I know about steam-powered cars is steam in locomotives, what you have to do is first you have to get the water boiling. You have to shovel in the coal and get it up to pressure. Because if you ain't got enough steam, you're not going anywhere. You can't just turn the key and take right off like on modern days cars. You had to let the steam boil up, and it had a temperature gauge, and you had to wait until your temperature reached to a certain amount, and then you could obviously take off. And of course, steam did also use gas. You had to light a pilot, and then you had to warm it up first, and once it got to the right type of temperature, you could move. Believe it or not, gasoline cars were not much better in the early 1900s before the invention of the convenience such as electric starters, patented in 1903 and implemented for the first time in 1912 by Cadillac, or the muffler invented in 1899 by Colombia's own Herman Percy Maxim, the same man that invented the first working firearm silencer. Gasoline-powered cars were extremely dirty, loud, and difficult to operate. Which we all know, seen how if you Google search engine Ford Model Ts, you're obviously going to see what they mean by hard to control, because you had your spark retardant, and you had a bunch of levers you had to fiddle with while driving and stuff, and there was no automatic transmission. All cars were standard, so you had to work a clutch and shift to certain gears. A misfire while hand cranking could easily result in broken arms, or dislocated shoulders. And even when early intention combustion engines work perfectly, hand cranking requires an enormous amount of strength and efforts to overcome the inherent enormous pistons and relatively high compressors. Yes, I know that they are stressed with hand cranking. I owned a Ford Model A tractor. Not a Ford Model A, but I owned a Farmall A tractor, and it was hand crank, and I had electric start but hand crank, and to work the electric start I would have to let the battery charge up because the battery would always die, so I'd have to hand crank it a lot of times, and the hand crank was kind of bent, so you had to hold it just right to get it to pop, and I at the time I couldn't afford a vintage hand crank car, so I went with a vintage Farmall A tractor. And yes, I know the kind of little bit of stress with hand cranking. Trust me, if you do it just right, you can have a hand crank come pop out and try to stab you. Juxtaposed against these two inconvenient, dangerous propulsions mechanism, electric cars were massively popular. They benefit from the same aberratures that have made them popular in their resurgence in recent times. They promised maintenance-free, silence, clean operation, and a fully contained, reliable source of power that required very little efforts to run. Charging amazingly was straightforward as well, with home charging stations available for owners with their own parking spot or electric garages that offered a vast recharge station to the owners who couldn't justify their own in-home unit. By 1900s, with 4,192 known registered vehicles on the streets of America, over 1,500 of them were early electric vehicles versus the less than 1,000 internal combustion engine powered vehicle. And dispute this fiercely competitive nascent market, there were over 2,000 companies building cars in America from 1900 to 1919 in some form. Columbia was an early dominant name. The company originally started when its founder, Albert Pope, turned it to automobile production in the early 1890s after marketing his fortune in bicycle manufacturing after the end of the Civil War. As bicycles demand finally began to evaporate and cars became more commonplace, his company built its first electric vehicle, EV, prototype in 1896 and was producing roadworthy consumer models by mid-May of 1897. A cold lens quickly followed by 1900s. Columbia set the record for the furthest range ever achieved with an electric car driving 96 miles on a single charge with an early runabout model. By 1902, it had become the first manufacturer to deliver over 1,000 cars in a year, beating Oldsmobiles to the sales records. Not content with simple production and setting records with electric cars, in 1904, its 300 horsepower gasoline powered car set the record for a Chicago to New York City drive in a scant 58 hours and 35 minutes, a 13-hour improvement over the previous record with an average speed of 24 miles per hour. If the speed wasn't impressive enough, the people choosing the Columbias were Teddy Roosevelt, became the first president with a motorcade in 1902 and rode in a Columbia Even Queen Victoria purchased a Phaeton carriage for her daughter-in-law, Alexander of Denmark, to drive herself around the grounds of her sprawling manor. By this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Columbia would dominate the American auto industry for decades to come. Unfortunately, Columbia started running into financial issues as the decades wore on, spurred on by poor management and an inability to update its models rapidly enough for the quickly changing market. By 1910, the company had fallen into receivership, and by 1913, the holdings company it had recognized under the United States Motor Company, a conglomerate, CONGLOMERATE, meant to take on General Motors, had collapsed completely. Columbia never made another car. Read about what it's like behind the wheel of a Phaeton over at the Drive. That's another website. My thoughts on this? That's a fascinating article. From reading it, this company, Columbia, you think, by the way, it sounds like it was going to be a booming car company, and then it just, due to poor management and stuff, went under just like that. So, yeah, and I like vintage cars like these. I really truly love them and stuff, and vintage cars from the 1900s. And I always personally thought if I ever had the funds to, I think it would be cool to build my own style car from the 1900s. Now, some people, they buy a car from the 1900s and restore it. Me, instead of restoring a car from the 1900s, I would build my own from the ground up of what I would do at that time. Granted, if I did do that, I would add some modern day features to a vintage car, like obviously modern day headlights and turn signal lights for obvious reasons, and then maybe like a lap belt style seat belt, But yeah, I think this is a really neat article, and I suggest y'all check it out. I'll put a link in the description about this, but my thoughts on it, I think it's a really great article. It's a good history lesson about vintage electric vehicles, EV as they call them for short. But it shows people that, some people don't realize that electric vehicles been around for centuries, for over hundreds of years. It's just when gasoline engines internal combustion gasoline engine became more popular, electric vehicles were kind of a little bit put on the side. And then, of course, steam-powered vehicles, they completely went away, where you just had electric vehicles and gasoline-powered vehicles. But gasoline internal combustion engines became better, especially when the electric starter came out, because what you used to have to do, and this is what I had to do on my Farm 08 tractor, was you had to turn the gas on, you had to, you had a choke, you had to choke it, and then once you turned it on, and you had it all choked, you turned on the gas and you had the choke on, you'd have to hand crank it, and you'd have to get the magneto just right where it'd be kind of stiff, and then you had to hurry up with your hand and, real fast spin. You had to grip it and real fast spin it. And then it'll all pop, and sometimes it will go pop, pop. And if I remember right, it's been a while since I've done it, you would have to kind of reverse to kind of give it a little choke, but it would take a while. But once the motor got warmed up, you could sit there and hand crank it like easy, And of course, the tractor also had a push button electric start on it as well, Well, but when the battery was dead, you'd have to wait until the battery warms up to use electric start. But then it was kind of pointless because when the motor was all warmed up and hot, you could hand crank it real easy, you know. But at cold start, I even in the wintertime tried starting it a few times hand cranking. I'd get it, but I'd be out there for a while. And so I could see why the invention of the electric starter came in quite handy on that. But yeah, I definitely think this is a great article. It's good if you want to learn. I say it's got some history behind it, and if you're fascinated with history of vintage technology, cars, whatever, highly check it out. And what fascinated me here, I'll again pop up this video, is it's the steering mechanism here. I don't know if you can see that. I'm not good at video editing, but again, if you look at the picture, you'll see the steering is just a little lever. Because some cars had a lever steering, and then they had a regular steering wheel. Which the regular steering wheel, for obvious reasons, became new, because it made it easier to control the car better. And then on top of that, you can add your other controls, like your spark retardant and your throttle lever. Because like on a lot of lawnmowers have a little throttle lever. That's what old cars used to have back in the olden days. They would have a little lever that you would adjust to adjust the speed of your car instead of a foot pedal. It wasn't until years later on someone got the idea to make a gas foot pedal instead, you know, and do away with the little rubber. Because on an old 1900s car, you'd have one lever for spark retardant and one for get your flow of your gas. And spark retardant was to adjust the spark plugs and how much spark it produced. And what you would do is you would listen carefully to how the motor run, and you would adjust that spark retardant until the car just kind of mellowed out and didn't run rough. If it was running rough and you had your spark a certain way, you would run rough, and you would always pull your spark lever all the way up, if I remember right, to start the car, and then you would adjust it to let it idle smoothly. And when it started idle smoothly, then you can take right off. And I can see why the gasoline dominated the market, the internal combustion engine versus steam power, because steam takes so long to warm up the boiler and all that stuff and things. But yeah, it's a really good article. If you like more of these kind of articles, please feel free to subscribe to my channel. I got tons of other videos out there on different articles and stuff and other types of content as well. So if you like this kind of stuff, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I'll probably do more of this, and feel free to comment below your thoughts on this article and your thoughts about electric vehicles, gasoline, steam power, trains, whatever the case may be. Comment below, and hope you all have a good day, and thank you for watching.